In a previous video session, we looked at the concept of consumer equilibrium and the conditions necessary for consumer equilibrium. Now, consumer equilibrium is consistent, or what we have discussed in consumer equilibrium can also be linked to, the law of demand. And also to prove that consumer equilibrium, we can use the concept of consumer equilibrium to prove that demand curves are downward sloping according to the law of demand. So let's look at firstly two products. We say a consumer, that is your MU of oranges. We use the same products and the price ratio of oranges, which is equal to the MU of apples over the price of apples. So we assume that currently the consumer is in equilibrium. This is consumer equilibrium. So the consumer has attained equilibrium. So yeah, so this is the equation for consumer equilibrium. Now we know from what I've mentioned at the beginning is when in equilibrium the consumer is maximizing total utility. So now what happens, for example, if the price of oranges decreased? What will now be happening with the equilibrium position of the consumer? So if the price of oranges decrease, how will that affect the consumer's behavior, right? So basically, if the price of oranges falls, then what will happen with the purchases of oranges by the consumer? If the price falls, then based on the law of demand, if we go back maybe just to to remind you of the law of demand, is that if the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and if the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. That is the law of demand. So what we are trying to establish here and to prove is that consumer equilibrium is, you can use consumer equilibrium and the condition for that to prove that you know the law of demand. And we're going to use the example if the price decrease of oranges. So going back to your equation here, if the price of oranges decrease, now what will happen with consumer equilibrium? What will happen with this equation? Consumers will buy more oranges because they are cheaper, right? So what will now happen with your equation? By buying more, the marginal utility that you gain by buying oranges will be more. So it means that the MU of oranges over the price of oranges, that ratio will become bigger. In terms of the MU of apples and the price of apples. So if this is the case, consumers are buying more oranges. So it means that the MU, every rand that you spend, you're getting more additional utility by buying oranges. So the MU of oranges over the price of oranges is greater now than the MU of apples over the price of apples. Now if this is then the case, then the consumer is not in equilibrium anymore, because this is the condition for consumer equilibrium. So the question arises now, what will the consumer do now to restore consumer equilibrium? Because by attaining consumer equilibrium, the consumer is maximizing total utility, and that is what every consumer wants. So what will the consumer now do? We have the position now of MU of oranges is greater than the MU of price ratio of apples. So what will the consumer now do to restore equilibrium? The consumer will buy more oranges, and then basically by buying more oranges, what will then happen, because the price has decreased, right? Okay. Then by buying more oranges, what will the consumer then basically, or what will be illustrated by this? When the price decreases, what will happen with the quantity demanded of oranges? The quantity demanded of oranges will increase, which is consistent with the law of demand, right? So the consumer is now attempting to restore equilibrium by buying more oranges, right? Because by buying more oranges, what will happen with the marginal utility of oranges? Well, according to the law of diminishing marginal utility, it will decrease. Remember, we mentioned that in the previous video session. So why will the consumer buy more oranges? Because the price of oranges has decreased, and this is consistent with what? with the law of demand. The quantity demanded of oranges will increase because of the price decrease. So by trying to restore equilibrium, the consumer is buying more oranges, and by buying more oranges, the quantity demand of oranges will increase, which is consistent with the law of demand. Okay, and out of this, by buying more oranges, what will happen? I've mentioned it previously. By buying more oranges, what will happen with the MU of oranges? Going back to the law of diminishing marginal utility, as you consume equal successive units of oranges, what will happen with your MU? It will decline, and you are buying less apples. What will happen with the MU of apples? Will increase, and in the end, what will happen? The consumer will then restore equilibrium, where your MU price ratio of oranges will then be equal to the MU price ratio of apples. So then the consumer has restored equilibrium. Why? Simply because the price, why in the first place has the consumer bought more oranges? Because the price has decreased. And in trying to restore equilibrium, the consumer is buying more oranges. And what happens with the marginal utility of oranges? It declines. What happens with the marginal utility of apples? It increases until equilibrium is again restored. But the important point is, in this whole process of restoring equilibrium, going from year to year, the consumer is demanding, the quantity demanding of oranges has increased. Why? Because of the price decrease. And this what is happening here is consistent with the law of demand. And basically what we have done now, we have proved that the concept of consumer equilibrium can be used to illustrate that demand curves are downward sloping, right? Demand curves are sloping downwards from left to right because of the law of demand. And we just use a consumer equilibrium basically to illustrate, the law of demand. And to prove that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So in the process of, here the consumer is not in equilibrium, so he is trying to restore equilibrium. Now the process of restoring equilibrium is that the price has decreased, and because of the price decrease you will demand more oranges, buy more oranges, marginal utility of oranges come down, marginal utility of apples increase, and in the end, equilibrium is being restored. But in that whole process we have proved, because of this, and this has happened, and then this is consistent with the law of demand. And that concludes this video session.